I'm very interested in art and in trying to figure out what art does in our society, what it sets out to do, and what it could do potentially more effectively than currently is the case. And that really comes down to, I think, assessing the 20th and 21st century, art attempting in various ways to address societal concerns and to awaken us to them. It's sort of an anxiety that I think is core to art in an obvious way, for instance, in Edvard Munch's Scream, but in ways that become pretty readily apparent pretty quickly when you start looking at movements such as Dada and Surrealism, Abstract Expressionism, pop art, and so forth. It seems to me that really what is being addressed is a fundamental sense of unease that comes out of the modern condition and that is meant to comment on it, or in a sense, I think, to illustrate it. And I think that that illustration is of some value, but that value is really limited. In other words, it seems to me that it's too tame. It is effectively in a museum, in a gallery, behind glass. It doesn't really have the effect of bringing out our anxieties in ourselves in a way that we then can address them. I'm not particularly interested in the artifact when it comes to art. What I'm interested in is the effect that that artifact has on an audience. I'm interested in how people think about themselves and their world, and how different artifacts or performances can lead people to think in other ways about what seems initially to be obvious, but actually is much deeper and more complex. As an artist, what I try to do is to create, in a sense, provocations that are open-ended. I don't necessarily know what they mean or what they will do, but I have the instinct, at least, that they will lead people to interact in ways that they might otherwise not do. And that interaction, being totally open-ended, ultimately can set the artifact aside, can set the artwork that I've created aside, and become a much more significant artwork in its own right. So one of my own anxieties, and I'm certainly not alone, is that we really don't seem to have any good way in which to get along anymore. Society is increasingly fractured, and conversation is increasingly turning to argumentation. We become more intolerant, and this manifests both in terms of erecting border walls and in terms of the nature of the conversation that happens within Congress or within people's living rooms. I'm trying to find ways in which we might be able to relate to each other outside of the animosity that seems to be effectively the standard in our society today. And that means, I think, trying to find something that we all have in common, some true universal. And so I was thinking about universals, and music in particular as one that we tend to speak about often when we try to think of what we all have in common. This is the score for the Universal Anthem. The anthem is written in 8 parts, and the score is visual. The reason that I've done it in this way is to make it as universal as possible in terms of who might perform in this musical work. I don't want to have some specific musical language that you need to know in order to be a part of the orchestra. It's totally open to you to figure out what you want to make of this. There are different levels of entropy for the orchestra and for the solo, and that is expressed through the orderliness or disorderliness of color for the 2 different parts in the score. You are meant to do whatever you think is appropriate, given how you as a soloist want to interpret this work, or how the orchestra may want to do so. And we had one performance, it was interesting, at the University of North Carolina in Asheville, where the orchestra was really remarkable for the fact that, like any trained musician anywhere in the world, these were people who were willing to take risks. And so the result was, while they had never seen anything like this before, in terms of the specific way in which I've expressed the entropy, they were able to improvise. And the improvisation of the solo and the improvisation for the orchestra were in stages of increase and decrease in entropy, such that the core idea, this idea of life going from disorderliness to greater orderliness, and then ultimately, after dying off, rotting and becoming part of the environment, this was expressed, where each individual, each musician expressed it in a different way. The open-endedness is, I think, what we need in society more broadly in terms of acceptance and in terms of receptiveness to other points of view. And a score that doesn't demand but rather simply suggests, I think, is the starting point potentially for that sort of open-ended conversation that ultimately doesn't need a score, that the universal anthem might actually be most effective once it is unnecessary and once we're simply communicating in a universal way without any sort of preconception whatsoever.